This hour on I24 News, President Trump is standing by his controversial support of Saudi Arabia, but members of the president's own party are turning on him over his handling of Jamal Khashoggi's murder.
These starving children are snapshots of the crisis in Yemen. Aid groups say 85,000 have died over the last 3 years.
And a scandal is emerging within the Women's March. The group that pushed for a progressive society is being slammed for anti-Semitism and homophobia.
From the I24 News studios in Times Square in New York, this is Crossroads with David Shuster and Tal Heinrich.
One day after President Trump rattled global allies and American lawmakers with his unwavering support of Saudi Arabia, the president is doubling down on his loyalty.
President Trump has cast serious doubt on whether the world would ever know if the Saudi crown prince was involved in the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. But now U.S. politicians on both sides of the aisle want answers.
Stephanie Ramos has the latest.
Congress is now demanding the Trump administration investigate what, if any, role the Saudi crown prince may have played in the murder of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi.
The CIA has looked at it. They've studied it a lot. They have nothing definitive. And the fact is, maybe he did, maybe he didn't.
The Republican and Democratic leaders of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, along with others, sending a letter to the White House demanding they investigate if the crown prince violated Khashoggi's human rights under the Magnitsky Act. Tuesday, the president pointing to the economic ties between the two countries. Despite the Washington Post reporting, the CIA has high confidence the crown prince ordered Khashoggi's death.
We're not going to give up hundreds of billions of dollars in orders and let Russia, China, and everybody else have them.
Today, he's thanking the kingdom for a drop in oil prices, tweeting, "Oil prices getting lower. Great. Like a big tax cut for America and the world. Enjoy." $54 was just $82. Thank you to Saudi Arabia.
And that was Stephanie Ramos reporting. One of the Republicans denouncing President Trump's support of Saudi Arabia is Senator Bob Corker of Tennessee. He's the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
But we have a crown prince that I believe directed the killing of a journalist. And the language that was used, it was as if they were writing a press release for the Saudi Arabia, not for the United States.
To break it all down, joining us here on set, all the way from Tel Aviv, is our Middle East correspondent, Emily Rose. Great to have you here, Emily. It doesn't seem as if there's going to be any further punishment on behalf of the White House against Saudi Arabia on this case, despite the sanctions against 17 Saudis who are believed to be involved in the murder of Khashoggi. How are other countries viewing the statement from the president, the White House reaction, and this approach of America first at all costs?
Yes, it looks as though this signals a ripple effect throughout other countries in the world. Most importantly, we have to look at Turkey. Turkey is a NATO ally, and it looks as though Trump is choosing the Saudis over his NATO allies. So this might signal to other NATO allies that the U.S. simply doesn't align with that allegiance. If we look at Germany, they've also mirrored that U.S. policy of sanctioning 18 other Saudi officials. And we've seen some private companies in the United States. If we look just a few weeks back to Davos in the desert, we've seen corporate companies, namely Uber, the New York Times, CEOs coming up pulling their support for Davos in the desert, that conference that the Saudis hold at such a high regard. But it could be that those also, even those private individuals and those private companies, will follow suit with the U.S. policy and look to them to lead the way. So it doesn't look like any more punitive measures will come, as you mentioned, from the United States.
Emily, this story has gotten a lot of attention in the United States, in part because the Washington Post has been driving so much of the coverage, given that Khashoggi wrote for them. But given all the experience you've had in the Middle East, what is the view in the Middle East of the Khashoggi case, and what's the expectation in terms of lessons that Saudi Arabia may draw from this?
Right, so the big lesson here that we have to look at is, what does this spell for Mohammed bin Salman as a leader? This was really his chance to show that he wanted to push reforms. He's coming out into the spotlight, in the United States and the world was really looking to him as this individual who could bring progress to Saudi Arabia. But if we look at his policies, it's almost ironic. Supposedly, if he is guilty of this crime, he did it in order to pull attention away from Saudi human rights violations, and yet it has garnered global attention and rebuke rebuke against the Saudi administration. And we can look at that with other policies, even that he did as defense minister. If we look at his choice to launch a war in Yemen, he did that supposedly to curtail Iran's influence in Yemen, what has brought the Houthi rebels even closer to Iran, right? And that partnership. So really, if what the Middle East is looking at and what the world is looking at here, it's how is Mohammed bin Salman acting? What are his policies? Are they bringing progress as he's promised? And it looks as with every step he makes in an act to make progress or change, he only brings, in fact, the opposite and inflicts the opposite upon his country.
Emily, we know that you have done some interviews with Saudis who were granted asylum here in the U.S. So what does this all signal to them? How do Saudis view this?
Right. So purely as from a human rights standpoint, there are Saudis here in the United States who are seeking asylum from human rights violations in Saudi Arabia. And we know that when we speak about Yemen, Khashoggi's death might be a tragedy, but those numbers in Yemen are a statistic. Really, Saudi human rights violations have been rampant throughout years upon years, and particularly cracking down on journalists and any human rights violations and activists. When I speak to activists here in the United States who are seeking asylum, they are very worried about their families back home. And when the U.S. makes a move like this, it symbolizes for them what actions will the U.S. government take against activists here in the United States? Will they still protect them and keep asylum for them?
Emily Rose, our Middle East correspondent. Emily, thank you.
President Trump has made it clear that he will stand by the Saudi Crown Prince despite the reported conclusions from the Central Intelligence Agency.
In this week's Diplomatic Dispatch, correspondent Christian Millard takes a deeper look at the president's reaction to Jamal Khashoggi's murder on the global stage.
As evidence points more and more to Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's involvement in the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, U.S. President Donald Trump says he will stand by the future king even if it's determined that he ordered the killing of the journalist. Trump seems to be satisfied that the U.S. Treasury Department had imposed sanctions on 17 Saudis involved in the crime, some of whom are close associates of the Crown Prince. Donald Trump keeps praising Saudi Arabia as a reliable ally, even after media reports that the CIA will conclude Mohammed bin Salman ordered the murder. He seems to minimize the importance of the potential findings of the CIA, even if it creates a rift with his intelligence community. The president's remarks this week show how deeply he has invested in Mohammed bin Salman, who has become the linchpin of his administration's strategy in the Middle East, from Iran to the Israel-Palestinian peace process, as well as the most important buyer of U.S. weapons, even if the latest pledge to buy $110 billion of U.S. weapons has not been completed yet. Saudi Arabia has also become the springboard of the American strategy to isolate Iran. The kingdom agreed to increase oil production to offset the loss of oil from Iran after Donald Trump imposed sanctions on Iran's energy and banking system this month. Given the disagreement generated by the Yemen war in the U.S. Congress, the Trump administration is likely to use the Jamal Khashoggi's case as leverage against bin Salman to wind down the conflict, as Houthi rebels, backed by Iran, have recently proposed a ceasefire before quickly resuming hostilities again. But all that doesn't solve the underlying problem, which is that Mohammed bin Salman is a destabilizing factor in the region. However, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has defended Mohammed bin Salman, who shares his antipathy towards Iran. Both the Saudis and Israelis have found in Donald Trump an American leader to endorse their vision of Middle East. But no matter the negative image, Mohammed bin Salman is likely to get out of the storm. There seems to be little doubt, even in the mind of bin Salman, he will be the future king.
And that was Christian Millard reporting from Paris. Coming up, the global police force has a new leader. A South Korean will be the next chief of Interpol, but it's a blow to Russia. We will explain.
Meanwhile, the Kremlin reportedly has a proposition for the United States and Israel. It involves removing Iranian-backed forces from Syria. Welcome back. These numbers we're about to give you are staggering, even for Yemen.
An international aid group estimates that in the war-torn country, the number of children who have died from starvation over the past 3 years is 85,000.
The nonprofit group Save the Children is urging an immediate ceasefire to prevent more loss of life. According to the group, the malnutrition deaths are preventable. The United Nations says about 14 million people, that's half of Yemen's population, are now on the brink of famine.
Yemen's humanitarian crisis is largely a result of Saudi blockades designed to weaken the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels. The Saudi coalition has been helping the Yemeni government attack the rebels. Yemen's government has been in exile since 2015. By all accounts, civilians, mainly children, are suffering the most.
Yes, we're afraid. Scared by the war, worried we won't have food. It's distressing. When the shelling and bombardment start during the night, I pray that God will protect us and the nation.
The United Nations Security Council is weighing in a resolution on peace talks for Yemen. For more on this, let's bring in I24NEWS senior diplomatic correspondent Nina Larson from Washington, D.C. Nina, the UN is leading efforts to reach a ceasefire. Their peace envoy is in the country. What is really going on here in New York?
Well, in New York, Tal, that's where the main drama is at the moment. The UK has presented a draft resolution that not only calls for a ceasefire and particularly a 2-week all-out pause around Hodeida port to allow that aid to go in, but it's also taking both the Houthis and the Saudis to task for using civilians essentially as human shields, targeting civilian infrastructure, targeting hospitals, all of that kind of thing that we've seen contribute to those absolutely devastating figures that Save the Children has just put out. That's the drama going on in New York at the moment. The UK was hoping it would be put to a vote sometime this week. But Kuwait, who is one of the non-permanent members of the Security Council, is objecting heavily. And that's because Kuwait is an ally of Saudi Arabia, of course. On the ground, Martin Griffiths, he's the special envoy that's tasked with all of this to try and bring the Houthis and the Saudis and the Yemeni government together. He's in the Yemeni capital of Sana'a as we speak.
And Nina, how big a setback was it to Martin Griffiths and this effort to broker peace, given that the ceasefire they had, at least for a couple of days, fell apart?
That's right. Well, we've actually had a little bit of an update, David. James Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, spoke to reporters just a couple of hours ago, and in his estimation, from what he's hearing, fighting has calmed a bit. There are still battles going on in the streets, but things have wound down a bit, so that is a good sign. Martin Griffiths has an almost impossible task, David and Tal. He is the interlocutor for the Houthis. He attempted to hold peace talks in September. They fell apart, mainly because the Houthis were reluctant to leave Yemen at all. But Saudi Arabia has made a concession. They're offering them some kind of safe passage, some guarantee that they'll be able to go to Sweden in the next couple of weeks. That's where the next round of talks are meant to be hosted. But again, getting all these parties together, getting them on the same page, seems an almost impossible task. But Martin Griffiths is a very experienced diplomat, and that's why he's the man for the job.
Nina, as you were speaking, we were showing some of the terrible images coming out of Yemen. We've seen this devastating report from Save the Children, this organization. How on earth, if you can explain, can this be happening to so many children under 5?
It's almost beyond belief, isn't it, Tal? Those pictures are absolutely heartbreaking. The problem is multi-fold, actually. It's there is a famine. Half the population are suffering from lack of food. But the other major problem is an economic one. There's very, very high inflation at the moment in Yemen. Wages are not being paid. And that is a key factor also in this resolution. The UK wants to see a massive injection of cash into Yemen's central bank. It wants to see hospital workers, civil servants, sanitation workers, very, very important in the fight against cholera, for instance, to get their wages paid. So it is an economic situation as well. A lot of people can access food, but they simply cannot afford it.
Nina Larson, our senior diplomatic correspondent, reporting from Washington. Nina, thank you. The International Criminal Police Organization has a new South Korean leader, and that's a decision that comes as a snub to Russia. Interpol's 194 member states have chosen South Korean's Kim Jong-yang as its new president. 57-year-old Kim is a former South Korean police officer. He was already Interpol's senior vice president. Mr. Kim accepted the position with excitement.
Kim beat out a controversial Russian frontrunner, Alexander Prokopchuk. He was also up for the role of Interpol chief. He was accused of using the organization's arrest warrant system to target critics of Kremlin, of President Putin. Russia blamed the outcome of the vote on, quote, unprecedented pressure and interference, but Interpol's Secretary General says it was completely transparent.
The General Assembly elected Mr. Kim from Korea as president through a voting process which was democratic, transparent, free and clear, and is the same for every candidate who serves in the executive committee.
The reason Interpol even needed a new chief is because their former leader disappeared. Meng Hongwei, here he is, he vanished last month on a trip to China. Beijing has since confirmed he has been detained for allegedly taking bribes. Kim Jong-yang will now serve the remaining 2 years of Mr. Meng's term.
To discuss, let's bring in Mike Baker, former CIA covert ops officer. Mike, great to have you. But before we talk to you about the latest developments, let's take a step back and ask you, maybe if you can explain, what's exactly the Interpol's role and how much power does it practically have?
Right. Interpol is like Europol as well. There's several international law organizations. Interpol is probably the best known from years of film and TV and books being written about it. It essentially acts as a central clearinghouse for international law enforcement agencies, and it does provide a very important service. It assists with international crime concerns that cross over multiple jurisdictions. So it's an important organization. This controversy related to the vote for the new chief of Interpol's, it's a little unusual in the sense that, okay, the Russians got their nose out of joint because, they didn't get their way, so, sad face emoji there. But in reality, that they've known sort of controversy in this regard before. You mentioned that the former head of Interpol was from China. Well, that individual, Mr. Meng, was also a vice minister of public security in China. So, look, the idea that that role may go to somebody who's from a country, an authoritarian country or regime that could then influence Interpol, we've had to deal with this before. It's just right now, I think it's in the spotlight because of particularly Russia's interference in elections, both in the U.S. and elsewhere over the past few years.
Mike, does Interpol change very much with this South Korean police officer taking over and it now going away from China's Mr. Meng being in charge or not having a Russian in charge?
Well, these guys are all well known. You mentioned that the new president, his previous role was as vice president for Asia. In fact, Prokopchuk's role was as vice president of Interpol for Europe. So he's been in and continues to be in a leadership role. The head of Interpol, it's not a figurehead position. In other words, it's not just a ceremonial position. You do set policy. You do have a great deal of say in the structure of committees. So it is a very important position. I think they've made a very solid choice with the new president. He's got a lot of experience. He was well supported by just about everybody, with the exception of the Russians. So I don't see that we're going to. Typically, when you get the new head in there, the world, doesn't see, general public doesn't see a sea change from one head of Interpol or any other international organization to another. But again, it is certainly a snub to the Russians. Putin sees it as such. Much like the Chinese, Putin has been trying to push Russia out into leadership positions in international organizations around the world. So, yes, this is a blow to Putin's, ego and to his efforts to have that happen.
But, Mike, do you think that the Russians might be correct in their claim that the Russophobic sentiment has won because their bid failed?
Could you repeat that question? I'm sorry, you were breaking up. I apologize.
The Russians, they claim that there is a Russophobia kind of sentiment against them, and that's why their bid has failed. Do you think they might be correct?
Well, I think there was some with very good cause for concern. Like, I wouldn't call it phobia. I would just call it realistic, view of what the Russians under Putin have been trying to do. So Putin will look at it and say, well, people are just, being, nonsensical, and it's all Russian phobia. But anybody with a realistic view on Russia's efforts, not just in the past couple of years. I mean, look, the Soviet Union, going back to World War II, has been involved in trying to influence public opinion in a variety of countries around the world. They've been trying to influence elections here in one way or another in the U.S. since the 1940s. So this is not anything new. I think it was the right move. I think we do need to be aware of and cautious of, Russian intentions. Do I think that they could have somehow controlled the world by, getting Prokopchuk into this role as head of Interpol? No. But I do think it's an important statement to Putin that, look, he can try to protest this all he wants, but, they got caught with their hand in the cookie jar during this last election, and they'll continue. It's not like they're going to stop. But this is a good, important message to Putin.
Mike Baker, former CIA covert ops officer. Mike, thank you.
And speaking of Putin, Russian President Putin reportedly has an offer on the table for the United States and for Israel.
He proposes removing Iranian-backed forces from Syria, but there's a catch. Putin wants sanctions relief for Iran.
I24 News correspondent Jonathan Regev takes a look at the potential winners and losers.
Will Israeli Prime Minister and newly appointed Defense Minister Benjamin Netanyahu be forced to make a choice between the two biggest threats on Israel, which he always claims are closely connected? According to reports in Israeli media, Netanyahu said in a close meeting this week that Russian President Vladimir Putin has offered to remove Iranian forces completely out of Syria. The price would be the easing of American sanctions recently reimposed on Iran after the American withdrawal from the nuclear deal, the same sanctions that even this week Netanyahu said were back in place, much due to his persistence.
I acted in every way possible to cancel the nuclear agreement and to reimpose the sanctions, and that's what has happened.
The report was not confirmed by any source in Jerusalem or in Moscow, but those who follow the decisions made in the Russian capital are skeptical such a major offer has really been made.
This proposal was supposedly made when the two met briefly at the Armistice Day celebrations in France. That such a momentous proposal could be made in just a chance encounter standing up in Paris seems a little dubious.
Judging by the fact there are few reports of Israeli strikes in Syria since the downing of the Russian plane 2 months ago, Russia may be relatively happy with the current situation. And even for Iran, there might not be an immediate reason for any change.
President Trump himself has granted exceptions and exemptions from the new sanctions to several of the major oil importers from Iran, so that the sanctions are not going to bite that hard anyway.
So, if this is the case, why would such a report even come to light? As always, look for the politics behind it.
But it seems to me more likely that it first came to light in Netanyahu's present political dire straits in Israel, rather than because of any change in the Russian position.
So, despite the latest report, it seems, at least for now, Israel will still have to live with that very troubling Iranian presence not far from its northeastern border. Jonathan Regev, I24 News.
Interesting. Previously, it seemed as if Russia doesn't have enough leverage on Iran to force them out.
Right.
All right. Still to come here on Crossroads, President Trump says he's going to a war zone. The pledge to visit troops comes after a week of criticism from the military community.
And those American troops who have been deployed to the U.S.-Mexico border and are spending Thanksgiving there, well, their deployment is apparently costing the United States $210 million. More on that ahead. This has been a volatile week for President Trump in terms of his relationship with the U.S. military community.
Right, but now it appears the president is making a move in hopes of getting on a better standing with his troops and veterans. President Trump now says he will visit a war zone. Visiting U.S. troops in the field has long been a presidential tradition that's been important to the military. Over the past week, the president was criticized for not yet completing this tradition. But now, without giving a time or a place, Mr. Trump says it will happen soon.
This comes after President Trump has been taking some heat from the military community community for his use of U.S. troops at the border with Mexico. And the president also seemed to insult retired Navy Admiral William McRaven, saying that he should have caught Osama bin Laden sooner. But let's bring in our senior national correspondent, Michael Schuer. And Schuer, do you have an idea which war zone President Trump would conceivably go to and how it might help him?
We don't know yet. The president has, as you said, taken a lot of heat for the fact that he has not done a trip which is really almost a Thanksgiving tradition at the very least, but also something the presidents in the past have done, gone over to see troops abroad. But again, this president didn't go down. He sent Secretary Mattis, James Mattis, the defense secretary, down to the border to visit the 5,800 troops he had dispatched there for border patrol. He's not someone who went to Arlington Cemetery even, which is just across the river from the White House, to visit the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier on Veterans Day. And this is straining his relationship with the military. And wherever he does go, he's going to probably get some criticism once there for using the military almost as a prop occasionally until he can dig himself out of this hole that he finds himself in with the military. David?
Michael, to a different topic, Chief Justice John Roberts, he criticized the president today in quite a rare manner. What is it about?
Well, it's about the fact that the president has taken on the judicial system over and over publicly, this time about the ruling that came down from a San Francisco court. He's taken down the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals on numerous occasions. This is somebody who has had an aggressive posture, a publicly aggressive posture with the judiciary. And this is John Roberts, the Chief Justice of the highest court in the country, saying, hey, back off. You know, we take our job seriously. We are, we take the law seriously, and we are people who want to not see others in our field criticized by the president, to politicize it in a way. The president called them Obama judges, Bush judges. Justice Roberts says we don't see it that way. We just consider ourselves judges and justices. Tal?
Michael Schuer, senior national correspondent. Shu, thanks.
Got it.
Back to immigration, the Pentagon now says using thousands of military troops at America's southwest border will cost an estimated $210 million under current plans. Right now, there are nearly 6,000 active duty troops providing support to Customs and Border Protection officers at the Mexico border. The military members were meant to provide assistance with the migrant caravan, which has now arrived in Tijuana, Mexico. But Military Times is now reporting that the White House has given troops the okay to use lethal force if needed.
Busloads of Central American migrants have been unloading in Tijuana for several days, and authorities there are struggling to handle the influx. There have been some clashes with police and Mexican border residents. Officials in Mexico are threatening to deport the migrants as tensions flare. Let's bring in David Leopold, immigration attorney, and Christine Flowers, attorney and columnist for The Inquirer. And Christine, can you explain what the U.S. military mission has been along the southwest border, other than them putting up barbed wire along the fence?
No, I wish I could. I think it was, well, the timing was rather suspect because it was obviously, right after the news of the caravan was broken, and also it was right before the midterms, and I think it was for the optics. I have no problem with President Trump trying to fortify the border, and I do understand that the Border Patrol does have a very difficult job. I have a true problem, though, with using the military as basically a stunt. And this would, if indeed he is talking about allowing the military to use lethal force and to engage, that would seem to violate the Posse Comitatus law, and that would most likely be unconstitutional. So I'm not really sure what exception to that law he's referencing when he says that he could use them beyond the optics and beyond the support that they're doing, laying wire and just being support staff for the Border Patrol that are there.
David, what do you think about the idea of letting the military use lethal force and about the idea of having troops there? Is it really part of a political stunt that was relevant before the midterms, maybe?
Well, it's worse than, of course, it's a political stunt, but it's worse than that. We've got the most anti-immigrant, extremist administration, president in the history of the country. And not only are they using the troops as a stunt, a cheap political stunt, at the expense, by the way, of the brave men and women who serve in our armed forces and should be home tonight and tomorrow night with their families, but instead they're serving the president's selfish political reasons. But it's worse than all that. You've got, what do we have going on? We have roughly a couple thousand people who are desperate folks coming up from Central America, looking to flee horrible domestic violence and gang violence, doing something that's absolutely legal under our law, applying for asylum in the United States. So there is no mission for these troops. We have a government, a president, chief of staff, John Kelly, Kirstjen Nielsen. None of these people respect the rule of law. None of these people respect human rights. This is a travesty, and what we have to do as American citizens and as voters is change this.
David, they have argued, though, that there may be some sort of chilling effect, that if the migrants who are traveling through Mexico see the United States putting armed troops, members of the military along the border, it might dissuade some of those migrants from moving to the north. What's your reaction to that argument?
We already have armed troops at the border. They're called Customs and Border Protection. And they have arms, and they patrol the border and so on. And it doesn't stop desperate people from seeking asylum, whether it's at the southern border, whether it's at the ports of entry in New York or LA or elsewhere. Look, our country, the United States, is a signatory to international protocols on asylum, on refugee. Our government, by refusing to accept refugee applications and asylum applications properly through the ports of entry, is in violation of international law and in violation of our own Immigration and Nationality Act, specifically Section 208, which permits people to apply for asylum in the United States regardless of how they get here.
But, Christine, what's your take on the president's attempt to change the asylum rules, although right now it's blocked because the San Francisco justice has blocked it for now. But do you think that the system needs a change in terms of asylum seekers?
You know, and I wanted to address one quick thing that David said. I am also opposed to the military being at the border. I'm opposed to some of the draconian rules and regulations that the administration has put into place, especially under former Attorney General Jeff Sessions. I would, though, in all fairness, note that to characterize the group of people or any group of people that are coming to the border as simply refugees, as simply people who are seeking refuge, that's not entirely correct, because there are individuals who are coming through the border, coming through areas in the border, who are members of gangs, who do not come, who are not there simply because they are refugees. So we really do need to establish that it's not entirely fair to criticize the administration for worrying about what and who is coming to the border. That being said, I think that the attempt of the administration to deprive and prevent individuals from seeking asylum wherever they happen to be coming into the border is incorrect, because you can vet them at wherever they are. You can vet them and determine whether or not they are criminals or gang members. You simply can't violate international law in attempting to try and stanch the flow of refugees at our border.
We got to leave it there. Christine Flowers and David Leopold, thank you both for coming on. We appreciate it.
I'm wondering what costs more, keeping the troops there or vetting the migrants?
I have a feeling that keeping the troops there with all their equipment and everything, their deployment, that's, I mean, $200 million in just a couple of weeks.
Could be.
Just ahead, women entangled in both sides of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict are telling their stories on social media.
And up and away, these characters are getting a practice run ahead of New York City's famous Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. That's coming up. Last year, millions of people around the world unified for women's rights following the inauguration of President Trump.
Thousands of demonstrators will hit the streets again in January, but a scandal involving anti-Semitism and homophobia within the Women's March organization is threatening the reputation of the movement.
I24 News correspondent Ariel Hickson has the details.
2 years after the Women's March movement sparked the largest single-day protests in U.S. history, and a record number of women were just elected into office, controversy may be dismantling the group. This week, the founder of the Women's March, Teresa Shook, asked her co-chairs, Bob Bland, Tamika Mallory, Linda Sarsour, and Carmen Perez to step down. In a Facebook post, she calls out her colleagues, saying, in opposition to our unity principles, they have allowed anti-Semitism, anti-LGBTQIA sentiment, and hateful racist rhetoric to become a part of the platform by their refusal to separate themselves from groups that espouse these racist, hateful beliefs. Sarsour has come under fire for failing to condemn Nation of Islam leader Louis Farrakhan, who is notorious for anti-Semitic and homophobic comments. Sarsour was then criticized for defending Minnesota Congresswoman-elect Ilhan Omar over her support for boycott of Israel, saying the BDS movement was led by folks who masquerade as progressive but always choose their allegiance to Israel over their commitment to democracy and free speech. Mallory and Perez were also criticized for praising Farrakhan. The women had posted pictures with him on social media. Farrakhan said this just a week before the Tree of Life shooting in Pennsylvania.
So when they talk about Farrakhan, call me a hater, you know what they do? Call me an anti-Semite. Stop it. I'm anti-termite.
Following Farrakhan's statements, critics have asked the Women's March to denounce him, but the co-chairs have declined, saying they reject all forms of racism and anti-Semitism. In response to Shook's post, the Women's March released a statement saying, Teresa Shook weighed in irresponsibly, as have other organizations attempting in this moment to take advantage of our growing pains to try and fracture our network. Groups that have benefited from our work but refuse to organize in accordance with our unity principles clearly have no interest in building the world our principles envision. The next march will be held on January 19th, 2019. Ariel Hickson, I24 News.
You know, the four co-chairs, I mean, they are lightning rods. Linda Sarsour, as Ariel pointed out on the piece, I mean, she is extremely controversial. And I think I'm not surprised that Teresa Shook, who's in charge of the organization, would say it's starting to distract from the larger mission that the Women's March is supposed to stand for.
Exactly. I can totally see why the Women's March was an important, prominent movement back after the 2016 presidential election. But right now, their goal seemed to be lost. And I can understand why some women say, I can't be a part of this anymore. It's not what I signed up for.
Yeah, and there's a certain discipline that you expect of people at the head of the organization. That is, if they really do want to engage with Minister Farrakhan and send out their tweets and their explosive stuff over social media, that's fine, but they have to choose that and not be part of the leadership in the organization.
Exactly. It seems as if they're using the platform, the crowds that this movement had gathered to promote other political agendas.
Agree.
All right, women whose lives are entrenched in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict sometimes find it hard to express their reality.
But this generation of young people is now utilizing social media to tell their stories and show the world what they live through on most days.
I24 News correspondent Lottie Balin gives us a look.
These two groups of young women live on opposite sides of the Israel-Gaza border, separated by a barrier of walls, barbed wire, and years of conflict between their communities. They have taken to social media to tell their own stories, which both sides believe are misrepresented or misunderstood.
We opened the Instagram account to raise awareness of our situation that we experience every day, in fact, for the past 7 months.
The rockets have stopped flying for the moment, and the world's eyes have already moved on. But the people of Gaza and Israel's border communities continue their lives waiting for the next crisis.
Even though life here is not nice and normal, we capture a picture that shows that life here continues and that it is fine. Furthermore, not all days are flowers and honey. There's this and there's that. During the bad days, we have to put the spotlight on something that changes the stereotype about Gaza.
Above their heads fly Israeli warplanes that destroy buildings in Gaza's busy streets. In the other direction are fire kites and trails of rockets launched from Gaza by Palestinian militants at Israeli towns and villages.
Gaza is closed. Not a lot of people have access here. So when you can, it's like you show Gaza through your eyes when you use Instagram.
On the Israeli side, the Instagram account Otef Gaza, which means Gaza Periphery in Hebrew, was started by a group of teenage girls from the Gaza border communities who want to share their experiences of life under fire.
This is our routine. I have friends in other places in Israel. People are not aware. They don't know that this is our reality, which we have been experiencing since March, and they simply ignore us.
In just 1 month, Otef Gaza has gained more than 90,000 followers. Photos of burned agricultural fields appear alongside videos of Gaza protests and missile launches to document their impact on Israeli communities. A raw lens of conflict from those that live and breathe it every day, whose lives are affected each second, even when the media and the world have moved on to the next story. Lottie Beelan, I24 News.
You know, David, social media is such an important tool in this conflict, not only because you can share if you're around the Israeli-Gaza border, you can share what you're experiencing, but because also the other side can see what you're going through. And it goes, you know, both ways.
In other words, they can interact, essentially. They can friend each other. What you use Snapchat, right?
Not Snapchat. I use Instagram. I use Twitter for sure, and Facebook mainly because in Israel, Facebook is way bigger than Twitter, unlike in the U.S. But I can tell you that what I learned from friends who live in Gaza, like something that I wasn't even aware of. When you think of women's everyday difficulties, think about, you know, they have power outages, right? They barely have powers, only for a couple hours a day. But then the women, sometimes the power, it comes back in the middle of the night. And then you have to wake up and start doing laundry right away. So it's just things that you don't really think of, and thanks to social media, you're getting awareness of.
And if there is a connection that people can appreciate these challenges on both sides, maybe that helps the conflict overall.
Right. We're shifting now to Europe. With a deadline fast approaching, UK Prime Minister Theresa May is rushing to secure the votes for her draft deal for Brexit.
On Sunday, the 27 European Union member states will vote on the plan, but as with everything involving Brexit, there are a lot of complications. Our senior international affairs correspondent Bianca Zanini has more.
The countdown for the big vote this Sunday has begun. UK Prime Minister Theresa May will have 1 hour to plead her case, and then the 27 EU member countries will vote on the long-awaited and much-discussed Brexit deal. Having survived one of the most turbulent weeks in Brexit history back home in Britain, with resignations and threats of a no-confidence vote, May on Wednesday rushed to Brussels for a meeting with the head of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, in a last effort to secure Sunday's votes.
The package of a deal that we are negotiating with the European Union has 2 parts to it. There's the leaving part, which is the withdrawal agreement, and there's the future relationship, which is what is currently continuing to be negotiated with the European Union.
In a significant show of support, German Chancellor Angela Merkel on Wednesday gave the draft deal her stamp of approval.
We know how difficult the discussions are in Britain, but I can say for Germany that we will agree to this exit agreement. It was hard work, and it's as complicated because an exit from the European Union is complicated on its own.
The draft has been agreed on, but there are still plenty of complications leading up to the vote. One issue, Gibraltar. Spain insists the peninsula isn't part of Great Britain and should have its own clause in the agreement. Madrid wants to make changes to ensure that the future of Gibraltar will be decided in direct talks with Britain. Other hurdles, the status of British military bases in Cyprus, agreements on fishing, and on overall customs cooperation. But despite these bumps, many analysts expect all the 27 member states to sign up to the Brexit deal. Unanimity is not needed, just a qualified majority, but politically standing together and sending a message of unity is important for the EU. If she gets her vote Sunday, May's final hurdle will be a parliamentary vote back in Britain. And as the past has shown repeatedly, when it comes to Brexit, it's impossible to say if there will be a deal or not. But rest assured, there will be drama. Bianca Zanini, I24 News.
And now we want to update you on a disturbing story out of the United States. A family of 4 was murdered in their own New Jersey home, and a relative is now under arrest. Police say a married couple and their 2 young kids were killed, and their house was then set on fire. The father had been shot in the front of the home, and the other 3 were discovered severely burned inside. The brother of the husband killed was arrested and charged with second-degree aggravated arson. Authorities believe the suspect, Paul Canero, also set fire to his own home just miles away. His wife and 2 daughters were inside, but they survived.
Crazy story.
Crazy story.
Here in New York City, there was a fiery crash on the Brooklyn Bridge that killed 1 person and cut off a major roadway on the start of one of the busiest travel days of the year. Black billowing smoke could be seen from across the East River in Manhattan. Officials say the 2 cars collided and burst into flames. Another car also got engulfed by the fire.
Want to tell you what was my first thought when I saw I thought it was El Chapo on his way to trial and he tried to escape. I swear, that was my first thought. It's terrible, but because we've been talking about the Brooklyn Bridge for such a long time. All right, it was not a good day for that kind of traffic nightmare. According to AAA, this year's holiday travel season will be the busiest in 13 years. AAA projects that over 54 million Americans will journey 50 miles or more away from home this Thanksgiving weekend. There will be 2.5 million more people on the roads, skies, and rails than last year. And it's expected to be a dangerous travel weekend as well. AAA expects to rescue 360,000 motorists across America.
And that rescue number is significant because the weather, and here we're looking at a live picture from Chicago where you can see so many people trying to get out of downtown to head to the suburbs and move on for Thanksgiving. The fact that AAA is going to have to rescue so many people is frightening when you consider this is going to be one of the coldest Thanksgivings in decades. Temperatures 25 to 30 degrees below the normal average. So that means that when people are in accidents, they get out of their car, they're facing very bitter
elements. I totally understand why they want to get out of Chicago. Yeah. Are you traveling?
No, just Upper West Side. That's it. The family's traveling to us. So.
Still traveling. All right. It's almost time for the famous Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade.
Yes, Tal, and some of those well-known characters are already getting ready for their big debut.
Here's beloved Charlie Brown. He seems like he's all ready to go, and it looks like he might be bowling this year.
We cannot exactly tell, but this looks like his pal Snoopy might be coming to life soon.
Oh, there's Snoopy, right. And here's what looks like Aflac duck?
The Aflac duck. You know, the doctor says, I need insurance, Aflac.
It's this one?
That's my Aflac impersonation. Come on. Anybody who watches college football knows about the Aflac duck, but that's okay. It's like it's help.
I thought he's like a cleaning product for the toilet.
Would you go to the Macy's parade? Assuming that, it could be a cleaning product, but assuming that the parade goes on. In other words, it can't be too windy because then the balloons go haywire and they could be dangerous. But would you go to the Macy's parade?
I want to go. I want to go. I suffer from the cold, but I really want to. I mean, it's my second Thanksgiving here in the States, so I think I should give it a chance.
Yeah, by the way, special congratulations to one of our producers, Amalia Goro. She just delivered birth. Baby Eve, a little girl. She's adorable. Amalia, congratulations to you and your family.
And happy holiday to all. That does it for this hour of Crossroads.
Stay with us on I24 News. Much more ahead.